Welcome back to our Economics of Regulation course. We already started with a little poll in the Webex chat. I just want you to remind you to what we did on Tuesday and asked a few questions concerning the Tuesday's lecture. One of the first question was, what is the share of the network industries in terms of GDP? I gave you 4 different possible answers. It was about 1%. Of course, it's not about 1%. 1% would be agriculture, for instance, or even below in Germany. I told you something, or I gave you the choice of about 3%. 3% is what you have heard in economics of innovation. This is the goal in terms of the European Union, in terms of the R&D expenditure as a share of GDP, and it's about what Germany spends right now. And the right answer, in a sense, is this very large interval from 7 to 10%. I just could show you here what I referred to. This is the slide where we have this, and where you see, okay, Germany about here. Germany about here has this 7 or 8%, even though that includes also transport, all the truck drivers. And here you see again this other data where you have about these 9%. And I don't know whether I mentioned that. What you already see here, the employment share is much lower. That means that the network industries are capital intensive industries. Okay, the 12% I also gave you an option. That would be relevant for the health industry. Our health sector or the spending on our health sector are about 12%. The second question was, what is the decisive feature of network industries? And here we probably would say something like that we have a bottleneck segment. We have a network infrastructure which cannot easily be replicated. We have huge economies of scale. That's why we speak here of a natural monopoly. We will discuss that in more detail later. We have high entry barriers, therefore we will not have perfect competition. We will not even have anything which could be called something like effective competition. And there are also externalities. And that's all these reasons, the lack of sufficient or effective competition leads then to the decision to regulate these industries. And then we have these other 2 questions. What is the main question of the normative theory of regulation, and what the main question of, or main research question, the main problem, the positive theory of regulation deals with. And again, we have a slide here. I just need to jump there. We have a slide here which provides this. I just have to look up here. You see the normative theory just deals with this question. Okay, we have identified a market failure. How should we optimally regulate that sector? Okay, once we have a market failure. And the positive theory, however, asks, okay, we have this Mietendeckel. Today the decision is to be given by the Bundeskartellamt. So this cap on rents for apartments and houses and buildings in Berlin. And this would be just a regulation. Why do we have that? Is there a market failure? And is the kind of regulation we have the right one? So you probably, as an economist, you probably would be rather skeptical of this kind of decision. But anyway, okay, so it deals with the question, why is there a certain regulation, and how did it came up as a result of interest groups, of the regulatory and political process, and so on. I think that was about the questions I wanted to remind you of, and actually it was mainly a check. It was mainly a check of how that works in terms of this polling device we have in Webex, and we will get back to that. But now I think without further ado, this should be sufficient as, in a sense, a reminder of what we did last Tuesday. Now I want to start with with today's lecture. And again, I give you the video. I watched it at a speed of 2 yesterday, but I think 1.25 should be okay. And I will again do or use the subtitles, the closed captioning. And if there are any problems, just tell me in Webex. Okay, welcome to Economics of Regulation, our second lecture. Yesterday I gave you an introduction into what the course is about. Today I want to jump to some basics and refresh something what you already did. Here you see the basics, or somehow, of course, perfect competition, monopoly as a benchmark, market structures. We will also talk about how we measure welfare and talk about efficiency, as we do mostly partial analysis. Our main focus will be on consumer and producer surplus. And finally, hopefully, we also can cover some production and cost theory, and I will introduce the term of sub-additivity, and we will discuss a lot about multi-product firms. Yeah, that's today's schedule or agenda. Perfect competition. I don't want to discuss that at great length. I hope that you all still remember what you did in your undergraduate studies, in your micro or in your intermediate micro course. If you don't remember everything, we will discuss that in more detail in the tutorial class, and hopefully you have also available your intermediate micro book, or you can use the sources I gave you. Okay. All of you know, hopefully, that in perfect competition, both firms and consumers are price takers. Typically, they are assumed to be small, so that the only variable they can adjust is the quantity. They either sell as the firms or they buy as the consumers. And that's what is stated here. Firms typically are small compared to the whole market. And usually, we have many firms in perfect competition. Later on, we will look into contestable markets, or perhaps you might remember from the Bertrand model and the Bertrand paradox that it's not always the case that you need many firms to have perfect competition, but usually, or to get a result of perfect competition, that's how I have to put it. But usually, we have many firms. The important thing is that the firms believe that their actions will not affect the market price, so that they have to take it as given. Yeah, and as you will see, and that was always held for all kinds of companies, if they maximize profits, they always equate marginal revenue to marginal cost. Okay, and in perfect competition, price equals marginal cost because marginal revenue is equal to price, as they are price takers. Yeah, here very briefly, profits. Here just a simple profit maximization problem of a firm under perfect competition. This is just to introduce some notation we will use mostly in this course. Like profit is always denoted as with the Greek letter pi. Pi here for the firm under perfect competition is a function of the quantity Q it produces and sells, and profit is a result of revenue and cost. So we just subtract cost from revenue, where revenue R is also a function of Q, and it's just price times quantity. Profit maximization then just means maximizing your profit, revenue minus cost, by choosing output quantity Q. As always, you know, we do that by applying calculus, just taking the derivative d pi dq, so the first derivative of the profit function with respect to the quantity, and set that equal to 0. Okay, that's what you really should know from your undergraduate studies, and or even from your high school time. And of course, as a result, if we take these first order conditions or derive these first order conditions, we obtain that marginal revenue, dr dq, minus marginal cost is 0, and that's a standard kind of optimality condition. So marginal revenue equal marginal cost. As we know here, up here, revenue is just price times cost, and price doesn't depend on choosing a price times cost, price times quantity. And if we take the derivative with respect to quantity and take into account that price is exogenous from a viewpoint of a perfectly competitive firm, we obtain that marginal revenue is equal to price here. Okay, and as a result, we get marginal revenue is equal marginal cost, and as marginal revenue is equal price, we obtain the last line that price is equal marginal cost. That's our standard result, and this is just a reminder. Okay, perfect competition. Here you get the standard diagram where you where you write quantity on the x-axis, price on the y-axis, and you get a standard kind of cost functions. We will discuss that in more detail later. We just assume here that you have some fixed cost plus some variable cost, and the marginal cost curve is the one in red. I'm sorry, right now you see somehow, for whatever reason, today Google produces German subtitles. And that of course doesn't make sense. I don't know how to change that right now, but so we will have to do without subtitles today. Functions, we will discuss that in more detail later. We just assume here that you have some fixed cost plus some variable cost, and the marginal cost curve is the one in red, and you have the typically U-shaped average cost curve, which is intersected by the marginal cost curve in its minimum, and you know that the upward pending part of the marginal cost curve is nothing else than the supply curve. That's what you know, and if you have some market price, you immediately get here the optimal quantity. And oops, that's not a very nice line here. And going down perpendicular, you have the respective quantity, and here you would have the profit of firm X. And you know that's what I will show you in a minute. If this is perfect competition, then if you would have such a situation, we would see market entry until the price is here down at the minimum of the average cost curve. And that's pretty much what's stated on the next slide. So here, first of all, what is normal profit? Normal profit in perfect competition is zero profit, namely that firms just earn the usual rate of return on their capital. So they will have a positive accounting profit, but this is just to account for the capital they use. Okay, so that's what you have. And for the marginal firm, actually, this holds only, and it's different, if we have heterogeneous firms, it holds only for the marginal firm. That means the firm with the highest costs. That price is equal average cost. That is the so-called inframarginal firms, the firms which have lower costs than the marginal firm. They will make positive profits. Okay, yeah, that's pretty much perfect competition. In I/O, I discuss in the I/O course in industrial organization, I discuss at some length that the number of firms in a market is not a perfect indication of competitiveness in the market. So you might have a perfectly competitive situation in production of refrigerators with 20 firms, and in say restaurants, you might have 500 firms or something like that. This is just depends on the minimum efficient scale. This is just what the minimum here is even denoted here, what the minimum of the average cost curve is. And if that's larger compared to the total market demand, you will have fewer firms. If it's smaller, you have more firms. But for more, see the I/O course. Oh, I went in the wrong direction. Yeah, I don't know, you might see in the slide deck you got that I jumped over a few slides. We will discuss in assignment 1 just a case or have a problem where you have to derive the market equilibrium for perfectly competitive market or industry. Yeah, the next and the even much more important market structure in terms of our network industries is a monopoly, because we will have many network industries where you typically pretty much have a monopoly structure, and therefore, of course, it's important to know how a monopolist would behave if there is no regulation, if it is unregulated. So what is a monopoly? Of course, it's a situation where you have only a single supplier. Remember that under perfect competition, that's what we just had here, the demand curve each individual firm use is just a horizontal line, because it has the price to take as given. The demand curve of a monopolist, of course, is negatively sloped. So here you have Q, here you have P. That's the constraint, the demand curve of a monopoly. If it's a real monopoly, it doesn't face the potential market entry. So we just assume that for whatever reasons, there is no potential market entry. We use the same notation. Q is quantity, C is cost, and P of Q is the inverse demand function. Pi here is capital Pi for whatever reasons is profit. And the standard assumption is that marginal costs are non-negative. They might be zero. Okay, so think of software. And the demand curve is downward sloping. Yeah, now the profit maximization problem of the monopolist, that's what we cover next. So it's completely analogous to the case of the firm under perfect competition. Here we maximize profit, again, revenue minus cost. Now here, the important thing is that now price depends on Q. So both variables in the revenue depend on Q. And if you take the derivative with respect to Q, you might also do it with respect to P, but it's more usual to do it with respect to Q. It doesn't matter, just say here, if the monopolist chooses Q, it automatically has chosen P and vice versa. Okay, whether you go from here to there or the other direction, it doesn't matter. It's just what is easier. And as for comparison reason with perfect competition, where firms choose Q as the quantity as their variable, it's better to use Q. Okay, now we get a first order condition, which is actually the same as under perfect competition. It says marginal revenue is equal marginal cost. Okay, the important thing is now that marginal revenue is not equal price, but there is another. I'm painting too much here, but again, we have a second element here. And this element is negative as P prime, the slope of the demand curve is negative, okay? So you get the marginal and the inframarginal effect, so you get the quantity effect and the price effect. If you churn out one more unit of output, you earn the price for that, but you have, in order to sell that, you have to decrease the price of all other units. Now, what we often do is we put that in terms this first order condition in terms of the elasticity of the price elasticity of demand, which is defined here. Nothing else than stating if I increase price by 1%, by how many percent does quantity decrease? We always usually just define it in absolute terms. We always know that if the price increases, quantity decreases, and that's what we have here. Okay, and now we can put this first order condition slightly different by using the elasticity and putting it in terms of the Amoroso-Robinson relation here. So what you see here, price, we can rearrange the left-hand side, just factor out P, so you get 1 plus Q over dP dQ divided by, we factored out P. Okay, and this is equal to C prime. But you see, this here is nothing else than minus 1 over epsilon. Okay, this is just the inverse of the elasticity. And if we use that, we get P exactly, the so-called and famous Amoroso-Robinson relation, that price times 1 minus 1 over epsilon is equal to marginal cost. Now, of course, you will immediately see if the price elasticity of demand is 2. That is, if you increase price by 1%, demand goes down by 2%. It's no problem, because you see then immediately you get 1/2 here as in a sense as a markup here. The markup is actually 2 here in this case. So cost would be 1/2 of the price, or if you multiply that on the other side, you get price is 2 times marginal cost. Okay. The problem is what you see here. If epsilon were 1/2, you would get 2. If epsilon is 1/2, this expression would be 2. Okay, 1 over epsilon would be 2, and the whole thing would be negative. Of course, that doesn't make sense. Okay, and if epsilon were 1, it's 0, and that does also not make much sense. Yeah, the price would be 0 if you have certain marginal cost. Okay, that doesn't make sense. So what happens? Yeah, then in this or at this point, of course, it's interesting to have an idea what price elasticities of demand are in the usual industry, and in particular, what is price elasticity of demand for the products and services provided by the network industry. By the way, do you know what the price of electricity is? Do you know how much you pay for electricity for 1 kilowatt hour? Okay. Do you know? Okay, you might even know that because that's typically in the very often in the news. Actually, oh yeah, you might write. I don't tell it. You just might write it in the chat if any one of you has an idea. But even if you might know that, so the point here is, if you don't know that, you probably don't react very much to changes because you won't even notice it. And you will even less know what the price of tap water is, okay, of the water you consume at home once you take a shower. And the point here is all these products and services like electricity and like water or services where demand elasticity is typically very low. This holds also for railway services, public goods services, so like public transport services. So very often you have a demand elasticity which is really inelastic. So you're even close at zero. Think also of the gasoline prices, where you also have, at least in the short run, a very low demand or price elasticity. But it also holds for electricity and so on. So there you have at most the demand elasticity, price elasticity of demand of say 1/2. But the point is, what is the right kind of price? What would the unregulated monopolists do then? So would the monopolists charge a negative price? No, actually, that in order to see that, so just look into the first order condition. What happens then? Because the pi, the q, is nothing else than p raised times 1 minus 1 over epsilon minus c. Now, yeah, but if epsilon is smaller than 1, this the terms in bracket is negative. Okay, so the whole term, the whole expression is smaller than 0. Well, this is not a c, okay, but it just means to be that it's smaller than 0. What does this mean? The derivative of profits with respect to output is negative. If you increase output by 1 unit, your profit goes down. If you decrease output, your profit goes up. So what is the optimal thing to do? So you sell as little as possible. That is, you can increase your price and so on. The other way would be just you increase the price, and that only very slowly decreases your output. And so you always get an ever increasing revenue, and your profit increases. So you sell next to nothing. So you, in an extreme world, you sell just 1 unit as say millions, okay, and you don't incur any production cost. The only point where you don't have trouble here is if marginal costs are 0, okay, then it's different, because, for instance, for software, we'll get back to that. This is important for electricity transmission lines, because actually the marginal cost for transmitting electricity will be 0. Okay, hopefully this short excursus on the Amoroso-Robinson relation gave you some idea why it's nevertheless interesting to look at this very basic kind of problems. Here, just for your information, the definition of the Lerner index, which is a common index of measuring market or monopoly power. What we have here is just putting that slightly different, rearranging the Amoroso-Robinson relation. What we get in the numerator is just price minus marginal cost. So this is an operating per unit profit divided by P. So you see that if 1 is equal to 1 over epsilon. So if epsilon, say, is 2, you know half of the price is operating profit of this company. This is more important, this Lerner index, in once you do something on competition policy or in IO. I won't spend more time on that at the moment. Okay, yeah. Small break here. I will ask for questions in Webex, and perhaps someone has an idea how to solve this problem with the YouTube subtitles. So small break here and discussion in Webex. Okay, we are back. There was some discussion right now. I asked you for the price of 1 kilowatt hour, and we got many close answers. Actually, it's about 32 cents. I wrote something. I don't know whether you even saw that. The average price in Germany for 1 kilowatt hour was in January 31.89 cent per kilowatt hour, and actually that makes us almost the world champion. We have the highest electricity prices all over the world, at least in the industrialized world. The second thing is, and the problem of these network industries is that demand is typically inelastic. So in a recent study, Koichiro Ito, published in 2014 in the American Economic Review, found that the medium to long run price elasticity for elasticity and electricity are very close. So the long run price elasticity for electricity is about 0.088. So it's very close to zero. That means that if the price increases by 10%, you would only reduce your demand by 0.9% or something, so less than 1/10. And what this does in terms of the monopolist is monopolist would charge an infinitely high price. Okay, of course there's also always a limit, but it would charge a very, very high price. Not only a price as rightfully stated in the chat, which is above marginal cost. It's way above marginal cost. So you have marginal cost of say 2, or currently what do you have an idea what the price of 1 megawatt hour, actually 1 kilowatt hour of, to make it more comparable, 1 kilowatt hour of electricity at the Leipzig EEX energy exchanges? It's about say 4 to 5 cents. Okay, that's the price. And of course, this difference to the 32 is not a result of abuse of dominant position, but it's just due to politics. It's just due to network so this is only these 4 or 5 cents is only the price for the generation, but you also have the distribution and the transmission lines and so on, and so you have Netzentgelte, so the network charges. Okay, and the problem is, of course, if it were unregulated, you would get very, very high prices. Yeah, we just now move on with the YouTube live stream, unfortunately without subtitles for whatever reason. Google produces a mixture of German and English subtitles. I just wonder whether you already got my question on the price of a kilowatt hour of electricity. I didn't get any reply on Webex, so I still give you the chance and wait for, so you see I already got one. That's a good idea, because I have your names right now. So if you give me the price of 1 kilowatt hour within the next say seconds, not after a long search in Google, you will get 1 point for participation. That's, I think, a good idea, so to motivate you to send us. That only applied to the lecture last year, okay, not this year. No point this year to the lecture. Yeah, here's just a standard kind of diagram you see with which monopolists, excuse me, economists, not monopolists, explain the monopoly problem in graphical terms. That's what you should know from your very first semester, your principles course in microeconomics. At least that's what I do. Here you get again quantity, here you get price. Here this is inverse demand. This is the demand curve. Here I assume marginal cost of constant marginal cost, and by looking into the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost, you go down to the x-axis to get the quantity, you go up to the demand curve to get the optimal price, and the yellow area is the so-called producer surplus. Okay, and what distinguishes producer surplus from profit? Now, you see here in a diagram, we only have marginal cost, not average cost. So we didn't, and the area below the marginal cost, this would be this here, is just a variable cost. What is missing is fixed cost. So producer surplus is profit plus fixed cost. Oh, but that's nothing new. Efficiency. Okay, excuse for the break. We are just at a conversation on Webex concerning the price of a kilowatt hour. Anyway, yeah, thanks. That worked great. Getting back to our slides here, efficiency. We want to have some welfare measure. Okay, we saw, and we will do that in more detail in a minute, that a monopoly. Or we will see in a minute that a monopoly produces welfare losses. We get the so-called deadweight loss. And now we have to have a measure once we say make some intervention in the market as a regulator, will that improve welfare or not? And so we use we use our standard welfare and efficiency measures, you know, from your standard econ or microeconomics class. So the good thing about economics is that economists typically have a very clear definition of what is efficiency. What is efficiency? Actually, what we start with here is Pareto efficiency. Economists call a situation efficient in the sense of Pareto if no reallocation of the available sources makes one economic agent better off without making some other economic agents worse off. And so this kind of efficiency definition is in a sense consensus among economists, because if a Pareto improvement is necessary or is possible, you always should implement it unless there is some envy or something like that. But that shouldn't keep you from implementing it. Just a small comment, you see that economists like Pareto improvements. The general public doesn't, as you see from our discussion in politics with in terms of the vaccination. So the question is, should vaccinated people have special rights? That would be just a Pareto improvement, because right now the status of science is that they don't infect other people. So you see here, general public is not so fond of Pareto, of the Pareto criteria. Okay, a problem with efficiency, and economists discussing with the general public. Problem in terms of partial market analysis is that that typically most measures you take lead to winners and to losers. Just think in terms of international trade. If you introduce a tariff, a Zoll in German, if you introduce a tariff, you will have losers. The consumers typically will pay more, but you will also have winners, which are perhaps workers and the firm owners in the industry in which which is protected right now. So we want to have a measure of well-being, a measure of social welfare, which in a sense accounts for both winners and losers, and just gives you the net of that. Okay, it gives you the sum of that, and if you say, and we would say then that we have an increase in welfare if the sum of total surplus increases. And how do we measure total surplus? Total surplus is made up of consumer surplus and of producer surplus. What is consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is a difference between maximum willingness to pay of a consumer for a unit of a good and the amount he or she actually pays. We will get back to that in the next slide or so. And aggregate consumer surplus is just the sum over all units consumed and over all consumers. Producer surplus is something I just introduced. It's a difference between the amount the producer receives from the sale of a unit and the amount that unit costs to produce. And aggregate producer surplus is then analogous. And total surplus or total welfare is then just the sum of consumer surplus plus producer surplus. Typically, we will use a slightly different welfare measure here in economics of regulation, because typically regulators are not indifferent in terms of distribution. They rather like to have that they rather weigh consumer surplus more than producer surplus. They don't say it doesn't matter whether consumers get €1 more or whether profit is €1 higher. We typically weigh these euros differently, but I will get back to that later. Okay, yeah, here just consumer. So that strange sign on a previous slide here, this guy here is just an arrow, okay? No letter or something like that. Consumers get €1 more or whether profit is €1 higher. We typically weigh these euros differently, but I will get back to that later. Okay, yeah, here just consumer surplus in a bit more formal terms, which you should know here, starting with the demand curve and the inverse demand, or excuse me, the demand function, which would be this here. D as a function of P, quantity as a function of price is a demand function. And here P as a function of quantity is the inverse demand function or demand curve. And now here the standard kind of diagram with the inverse demand function, that is the demand curve. And if P0, P0 is the price, it's clear that this triangle up here would be consumer surplus, okay? Because the demand curve gives you nothing else for this unit here. Of course, we would have to have some range here because, yeah. so that we get a positive demand. And this would be the willingness to pay. This is the price you have to pay, and this difference is just the consumer surplus you get, and the whole triangle is a consumer surplus. And just, you know, it's very easy to calculate triangles. It's just this height times the length here divided by 2. Once in a while, we have different demand curves. For instance, here, a so-called isoelastic demand curve, which looks like, not here, but typically it looks like a hyperbola. And here, a hyperbola is just not a triangle, so you need to do it slightly more sophisticated. That is, you use the integral. And now here are the integrals, and you can directly derive them from the demand curve. So here, this is the standard kind. This integral down here is the standard kind of integral you use. So here you take the integral over the demand curve, okay, and it's from 0 here to Q of P0, okay. It's the whole area below the demand curve, and this would be the whole area below the demand curve, so the integral from 0 to Q over P. And of course, you would then get what is called the whole area, including the rectangle at the bottom, and the rectangle at the bottom is nothing else than P0 times Q of P0. This is nothing else than your expenditure. And of course, in order to get a consumer surplus, or what is also called net consumer surplus, you have to subtract that. The second way, okay, that's how you do that, and if there are any questions, we can address them in the tutorial class. The second thing then, or the second way, is just to integrate in this direction. That is, in a sense, you do the inverse. Therefore, you have not the inverse demand function, but the demand function. And you integrate in this direction, you get, I'm getting crowded here, so I will try it with the text marker. You integrate in this direction, okay? And that's from P0 here up to P upper bar, the cutoff price, and you do that directly, so you get directly this consumer surplus. So it's nothing complicated, hopefully. Okay, that was it about consumer surplus. Yeah, what are the properties? Okay, now going back, or given that we now have our efficiency or welfare measure, just would like to ask if there are any questions right now. If you need a break, just tell me in the chat. I think we can move on and let this part just end. We can talk about what is good about perfect competition and what is, actually, it will be good about perfect competition. There's nothing bad about perfect competition. Unless you're a firm there who complains that it doesn't make profits. But in terms of welfare, you will see it's optimal, and we will compare then the welfare properties of perfect competition with that under monopoly. The important point here, perfect competition is technically efficient. That means that's what I showed you in the very beginning. So in the long run, we will get this after we have entry, we'll end up at a price equal to average cost and marginal cost, which is just a production at the most efficient scale. Okay, and this is what is meant by technical efficiency. And that means a total social cost of production is minimized. You also have allocative efficiency because price is equal to marginal cost, and everyone who has a willingness to pay, which is higher than the production cost of the last unit, he will or she will obtain that product. And that means that total surplus is at a maximum. That's what we like about perfect competition. And now here you see why we have a problem with monopoly. Here the price is much above marginal costs. You stated anyway. And what we obtain is this red area, which is the so-called deadweight loss. Here are consumers which would be willing to pay more than the cost of production, but they don't get it because why doesn't the monopolist serve them there? Because she would have to reduce the price, and price reduction, if the construction is right, would then lead to lower profits. Okay, that's actually the point we get. That's the problem about a monopoly, or one of the problems. And that's what I do next. The next point is that, of course, what you see here what we get in terms of consumer surplus is this small triangle up here, and you get a large producer surplus, which is the green area down here. So in monopoly, consumers are much worse off, and the monopolist is much better off. Okay, and that's what's stated actually in words here. So why does a monopolist produces dead weight loss? That's what I already told you. Increasing output requires a reduction in price, and if the monopolist cannot price discriminate and is forced to charge the same price to everyone, there is no possibility, or every other price or quantity would reduce her profit. Yeah, and of course, a monopolist is not interested in maximizing total surplus or total welfare, but maximizing her own surplus and not the consumer surplus. And therefore, we get the result that the monopolist undersupplies relative to the competitive outcome. We get an allocative inefficiency. That's what I already told you. And I already told you about these distributional concerns. This market power the monopolist has shifts the surplus from the consumers to the firm owners. And that's what in particular what regulators do not like. The primary problem is that the monopolist is large relative to the market. What does this mean? In Micro 1, I explained that problem by, say, looking into Bayern Munich. Bad air times for fans of football, but here you have a monopoly situation. And right now, a year later, bad times for fans of Bayern Munich. Okay, they lost, unfortunately, in the quarterfinals. Okay, so that should be enough for the moment. They also monopolist in terms of the tickets for the Allianz Arena, but actually, given the demand, they are capacity constrained. We cannot put more than 75,000 audience in the arena, and then they can just charge. And what is actually the marginal cost they face? Actually, the marginal cost is rather low. So this would be MC for a situation in which the arena is not fully booked, and they are next to infinity once. So this would be the marginal cost. I probably should use a different color here. This would be the blue line would be the marginal cost line, and they are very high. And now what you see here is actually the marginal revenue would be somewhere here, okay? And so they would. Not a very nice picture, I have to confess. But anyway, hopefully you get the idea. We might paint it in more detail in the. By the way, here I could just show you that I also could have notes. Oops. Even though that spends a lot of time. But I also could draw that here in OneNote, and actually that would be in your OneNote course notebook. Okay, so here FCB, oh, I have to write FC Bayern. Okay, Munich, here 75,000. Okay, and actually the marginal cost would be somewhere here, not down to 0. And if you have different color, this is demand, this is marginal revenue, not perfectly because this should be just half of the intercept here. Make sure to have that right. But what you see here is they would, if marginal costs were constant here, they would have to want more players here anyway. Okay, they would want to charge a lower price because they cannot charge a low price, and therefore it's actually the same price if they are just having a fully booked arena than firms under perfect competition would charge. So that's actually the point we get when the monopolist would not be large relative to the market, but would be small. Okay, and that's what we get here. And so this is already the potential reasons for regulation. We get allocative inefficiency, which is not very high if we have inelastic demand. Okay, remember, you don't consume much less electricity if prices is too high, because you even don't know what the price. Actually, some of you do, but some of you got it not quite wrong. We have here, in particular, the distributional concerns that this would shift rents to our monopolist. Yeah, so this was the reminder or refresher on. Okay, so now time for a short break because we are done with this part. I also drew it not better in the current version of your notebook, so you also have it, but you saw it here, this diagram anyway. Okay, so now we make a short break. Again, I ask for questions in Webex. Okay. The reminder or refresher on yeah, live stream seems still to work on perfect competition and on monopoly. I would move on now to the next chapter technology and cost. You might also ask some questions right now if you want. Okay, technology and cost. So this is also a refresher. Oh. And as this is going to be a bit more formal, but not very much. The starting point is typically the single product firm. The single product firm, and if you think of technology and cost, the first thing we look into is, of course, the production function. It determines, or it is how the firm's technology is described. It tells you how inputs are transformed into outputs, and in a sense, the production function gives you the efficiency frontier. It tells you what you can make out of your given inputs at most. Okay, how much output do you get at most? And typically, what we assume here is that we use n inputs. Maybe in the standard macro case, it's only 2 inputs, capital and labor. Here we will use more inputs, x1 to xn, which describe the input levels. Here x is the quantity of the input, and it describes the input quantity of each input. And if we assume that we have a single output firm, just say producing masks, then the typically way we write it that Q, the output quantity, is a function of the input quantities x1 to xn. Okay, and once we have given this constraint, which is provided by technology, we can look into the profit maximization problem of the firm under perfect competition. You might think, why do we do that again? Actually, in this refresher, I didn't go into the details. Where do we get the cost function of? Okay, we just stated that we have some cost function C of Q, and we didn't talk about technology. That's what we do right now. Okay, and if you do profit maximization in one stage, what does it mean? First of all, we just assume for simplicity perfect competition. In a minute you will see why this profit maximization in one stage is rather complicated if you have other market structures. Okay, what we maximize is again our profit pi, and our profit pi is nothing else than revenue P times Q minus cost. And cost, what is cost? Now, cost is Wi is the factor price of factor I. So W1, if factor 1 is labor, it would be just the wage. W2, if 2 is capital, it would be just the interest rate. Okay, and in order to get the total cost you have, if you have these inputs quantities x1, x2, and so on, you just multiply each input quantity by its factor price, so you get the expenditure on each input in your company, and then you sum it up over all n inputs. And so what you get here, this sum of Wi xi is nothing else than your cost. Okay, and you maximize here your profit by choosing the input levels xi, so x1 to xn, but you have to take into account your constraint in terms of the production function, which gives you the relation between the x's you choose and the output q. And what you are doing here then, if you maximize that, this is rather straightforward, because you can just write p or pi as p times f of x1 to xn minus sum of all Wi xi, all I over n. So once in a while I might drop something in the notation, but hopefully it's clear. And so you can easily substitute, no complicated Lagrangian or something like that necessary for those of you who are familiar with that. And what you do then is just take the derivative with respect to all the inputs. So you derive all the first order conditions where d pi dx1 would be, for instance, p df. Here's just all the x's, dx, I said 1 minus, of course, if you differentiate this sum with respect to x1, we just get w1, and this is equal to 0. But this is a famous condition here already, because it states here, this is nothing else like the VMP, the value marginal product, and this is just the factor price. So the condition for optimal factor input is, here you can put it just on the other side. Okay, equal to here on the right hand side. On the right hand side, you have nothing else than what is the additional cost if you use, say it's labor, 1 unit of labor, 1 hour of labor. That's additional cost of 1 hour of labor or 1 unit of labor. And on the left hand side, you have what is the return of an additional hour of labor. And this is nothing else than the marginal product of labor, namely how does production change if you increase labor x1 by 1 unit. Okay, that's the so-called marginal product. And times times the price, which tells you then what is this marginal, this, I don't know, 10 more masks you produce worth because you sell it on the market. So that's the standard kind of first order condition. Of course, you get the same first order condition for inputs 2, 3, and so on. And if we write a second first order conditions, and if I totally confuse you probably in that slide, you just would get the same thing, and you can, suppose I wrote the same thing, I just, I try to experiment with colors. I add just the second here 2, then this would also be 2, and this would be 2, okay? Now this is our condition for 2, and if we divide this condition, so we get FOC1, we get this is FOC2, first order condition 2. Previously we had first order condition 1. FOC1 is the one in blue. Okay, and now if we divide these two first order conditions, P cancels, or these two equations, P cancels out, and what we get is dx1 divided by oops, not a bracket here, dx2 is equal to W1 over W2. And this is famous because this is nothing else than the rate of technical substitution, this expression, this ratio of the marginal products, and on the right hand side you have the ratio of the factor prices. Okay, the rate of technical substitution, how you trade off the two inputs, depends on the factor prices. Yeah, and that's what you have, and you see that works quite well. If we would have given here a specific production function, we could now just derive that, and actually that's what you can do in one of the problems of our assignment. Okay, that was the way we derived the profit maximization. That were the first order conditions for profit maximization. If we do it in one stage, and there it's only easy if we have perfect competition, because you see it's already, at least if I do it, rather confusing, but hopefully you got it, and hopefully audio sound is in sync with the slides. Otherwise you really have trouble to understand it. But just ask me then on Tuesday in the tutorial class if something was unclear. Of course, you always can put questions in the chat, and also if you think I made a mistake, which usually happens once in a while, in particular in terms of notation, just tell me that. Okay, even though it's delayed, but I can correct it then afterwards. Yeah, usually we don't do it this way. What you might see, we never talked about a cost function here. Okay, there is this other way, namely profit maximization in 2 stages, and that's what we do most of the time. In 2 stages means we first of all minimize cost of producing a given level of output. That is, we derive the cost function, and once we have the cost function, we can move forward as we did in the previous chapter, where we then just maximize profit by looking into revenue minus cost. So, and what is the cost function? It's just the relationship between output choice and production choice. First of all, we need to find a minimum cost combination. So what is the input combination that minimizes costs for a given output? And here the the cost minimization problem is something which looks familiar to what we just did. We just dropped the revenue part and just look into this cost expression I explained to you, and we want to minimize cost. And as a constraint, we have that we produce a given output level Q1. So we have our output Q, and this is then the output level Q1. So we need to have inputs which guarantee X1 input quantities X1 to Xn, which guarantee that we have what we produce this output level. Okay, so I think you will have to suffer again to my handwriting here. Now it's not so easy because you see there is no Q nowhere. And okay, before we get to the second kind of formal derivation, I just ask for questions in a Webex chat. We cannot easily substitute. That's where the Lagrangian method with optimization under constraints comes into play. Here we minimize then, namely our costs, sum over all i's from 1 to n, wi xi minus, and now here hopefully most of you know that. Those who don't, ask me again in a tutorial class, and also look up a book like Perloff or the other textbooks, in particular the Press McAfee book, how you do optimization under constraints. You also should have done that in your math class. Okay, but here we get the so-called Lagrange multiplier with which we add our constraint, which is nothing else than the x1 to xn minus q1. So we put the constraint here so that its value is 0, so that it's satisfied. Once we have that, we just take the derivative of L of the Lagrangian with respect to now what we are maximizing. Again, that's what you saw up here. We maximize according to our axis, our inputs, and now just take the derivative with respect to input 1. Again, we get now here W1 minus lambda, and again we get the df over dx1, which is nothing else than our marginal product. Okay, and you see actually that looks very similar to what we had on a previous page. What I mean here, you hardly can recognize it. What I mean here is this condition, where we had on the one hand side the factor price, and on the other side we had this marginal product. But the point here is we had this marginal product, we had a marginal value marginal product, and we had the price as an additional factor here. But it's actually the same. Okay, and now what you see, I jump back again here, we can immediately derive this condition on the RTS, on the rate of technical substitution, which is here this. Do you see if I move? I don't know. So I cannot jump around and point to it, but that's why you always see this. Perhaps that's the reason why they had the laser pointer here. Okay, now here, you see I'm learning here to present. This is our ratio of the marginal products, and here's the ratio of the marginal of the factor prices. And now you see immediately without the need that I derive that, if we take now the first order condition for input 2, for instance, and divide that from each other, we would get W1 over W2 is the share of the marginal products. We get the identical condition as we have in single stage product profit maximization. Okay, and yeah, so and what we can do, and actually what you will do as part of the assignment in some of the problems, you will derive or will have to derive the cost function for a specific production function, namely the Cobb-Douglas production function in our assignment 1. Actually, as I have it here anyway, I can even show that to you. Okay. Here we have, looks awful, but here we have our, I don't know how I can, here we have, oh, it even works. Here we have our production function, which is a Cobb-Douglas with labor and capital. And that's where you have to derive the cost function down here. The cost function is ugly, but I gave you some hints on how to do that, and yeah, you get the result here anyway. So at least try, should hopefully be clear. Okay, so you will know whether you understood it. I want to mention some further point here using a different color. You see here the lambda. Actually, you know that the lambda in the previous optimization was nothing else than the price level, okay, the output price. And now, what is interesting here, if you take the derivative of L of the Lagrangian with respect to the output here, Q, you get exactly lambda. Lambda is nothing else than what is called a shadow price of here the output. And the shadow price of output is nothing else than marginal cost. Okay, that's a shadow price of output. And in perfect competition, marginal cost is equal to marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, and marginal revenue is equal to price. Okay, we might get back to that as well. The important thing is with cost minimization, you see that here, it's really the marginal cost and not the price. If you look into monopolies, because a profit maximizing monopolist would minimize cost, but choose a price which is not equal to marginal cost. Okay, so you would have this divergence here for firms market structures which are not perfectly competitive. Okay, so in a second stage, you probably hardly can read that, but in a second stage, you maximize profit by choosing output subject to the cost function, and the cost function is really then the outcome of C of Q. Okay, that's what the product of this cost minimization is. Of course, the cost function also depends on the factor prices, W1 to Wn. But our standard assumption here in this kind of partial equilibrium model is that these firms are just price takers. Okay, even our network industries are not so large that they can influence the price or the cost of capital or the price in the labor market. Yeah, the analysis. I'm running out of time here. But the analysis gives you just the cost function. That's what I wouldn't have to write, wouldn't have been necessary to write down as well. And usually we use this standard kind of cost function where we assume that some factors like capital are fixed. So we get fixed cost plus variable cost, which are a function of then the output, of course. And average cost is, you know that well, is just the total cost divided by the output. You get fixed cost, the marginal cost or the additional cost of producing one more unit. So this is just all from the undergraduate studies, and the marginal cost or the slope and the derivative of the total cost function. What is new and what we will discuss in more detail later is sunk costs. Sunk costs are independent of output and therefore are like fixed costs, but they are incurred on entry and you cannot recover them on exit. The most important example, for instance, and the literal example is the Eurotunnel. You sunk some cost there, and if you would close the Eurotunnel down because it makes losses or something like that, you cannot recover these costs. Whereas if you currently run some business and you have a rental contract with a housing or some real estate company, so this is your monthly fixed cost. But once you quit that contract, of course, with the appropriate terms of I don't know how it's called, Kündigungsfristen. So according to the state or to the date set for quitting the contract. Okay, but then you no longer have to pay this fixed cost, but the sunk costs are still there. Yeah, cost and output decisions, marginal cost, that's what we previously saw, determine how much output you produce. Average cost determine whether you produce at all. That's it determines the shutdown decision. And finally, the sunk costs. We will get back to that on Tuesday in the tutorial class. And finally, the sunk costs determine whether the firm enters the market as a whole, because here with the shutdown decision, typically the average cost wouldn't take into account the sunk costs. So as long as you can pay for all the other costs apart from the sunk costs, you would still get a positive Deckungsbeitrag in German, so a positive income, which at least covers your sunk costs partially. Sunk costs only determine whether you enter the market, and you only enter the market if you expect to cover also the sunk costs. But if you already entered the market, and if you sunk these costs already, they are no longer important to your decision. That's an important point once we discuss in the next chapter, contestable markets. Yeah, you must expect to cover sunk cost of entry. Now, okay, finally, we are getting to the economies of scale. What we did up to now was only a reminder of what you should have done in your undergraduate studies. But now there's something which is hopefully a little bit new to you. Average economies of scale are not so much, you have heard about that, but in a minute we will apply to multi-product firms, and that's probably something which is new to you. What is the definition of economies of scale? It simply says that there are economies of scale if average costs fall with an increase in output. Okay, we will represent that by a scale economy index, but just to highlight the standard way we get, I go back to, I just draw a picture here in my OneNote. Here you have Q, here you have MC and AC, and the standard case for economies of scale is that you have some constant kind of marginal cost, and you have some fixed cost. That means then that your average costs are downward sloping and approach marginal cost in the limit. So what you see is that we get economies of scale here. The more you produce, the lower our costs per unit. Okay, so this is now. And you can represent this degree of the economies of scale by this scale economy index, which just has then divided the average cost over marginal cost. And if we go back to our slide, you will see that it's always that the average cost here in this small picture are higher than the marginal cost. So the scale economy index would always be larger than 1. And that's actually what we get here. You have economies of scale if average costs are higher than marginal cost. You have diseconomies of scale if they are slower. Okay, if you, I can jump back here, or probably that takes too much time. But anyway, if you go back to our example of the U-shaped marginal cost, you see here to the left of the minimum efficient scale, you would speak of economies of scale. To the right here, marginal costs are higher than average cost, so we have diseconomies of scale. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, and a nice thing here is we can define or derive the so-called elasticity of cost with respect to output. This is this eta C, and this is this expression. What does it tell us? Now, in a denominator, you have dq over q. This is nothing else than a percentage change in output. And we want to know if we increase output by 1 or say 10%, by how many percent does a cost increase? This is nothing else. This is nothing else here than our percentage change in cost. Okay, so this is the cost elasticity with respect to output. If it's 2, you would say output increases by 10%, cost increase by 20%. If it's 1/2, output by 10%, cost by 5%. And now you see immediately the relation to the scale index, because you can easily rearrange that what I did here. So go through it, so it's easier to do that. And what you see is you can rearrange it so that it yields that it's identical to MC over AC, which is just 1 over S. So S is just the inverse of the elasticity of cost with respect to output. We know if S is greater than 1, we get a cost elasticity which is smaller than 1, which makes perfectly sense. If we have economies of scale, we know costs increase by less than the percentage increase in output. Okay. Yeah, just a reminder, you might also have heard of returns to scale. Returns to scale are different from economies of scale, but very similar and related. Returns to scale are defined with respect to the production function. We previously had what you're doing when you look into returns to scale. You just, for instance, double each input and look how output changes. And if you have constant returns to scale, that would mean you double each input and output also doubles. That would be just a situation in which you don't have economies of scale. and if you have returns to scale, that is, you double inputs and your output more than doubles, you certainly have economies of scale. But you might also have economies of scale when you don't have returns to scale, just related to fixed cost and so on. Okay, I don't want to go into details here, but just think of capital as some fixed cost or something like that. Okay. Just why do we get or what are sources of economies of scale, and in particular, why it is so important here in this course on network economics? Now, the point is here, we have very often these kind of downward sloping average cost curves. We have sources of economies of scale, which would here even be returns to scale. Once we look into pipelines, this is what you know with the difference of an area of a circle, which is r squared pi, the Greek pi, the 3.14, and you know, this would be the area, and the circumference would be 2r pi, and the circumference, which determines how much steel you need for this pipe, increases slower than the area. Therefore, you have the 60% rule. Capacity rated to volume by cost is related to the surface area. So larger pipelines cost less in comparison to the capacity they carry. Product specialization and the division of labor. I think, yeah, it's clear if you want to do some jobs, it's easier if you do it if you have two people doing that, because they are quicker than if you have twice one guy doing that. That's why all your Handwerker, your how do you call all the trade people come at least in teams of two. Okay, yeah, what is more interesting here is that you have the two things here, the indivisibilities and the economies of mass reserves. Economies of mass reserves, of course, if you have a small company, you need an accountant, and if you're a large one, you also need one. And of course, if you have only 2 or 3 people, it might be a problem. Or also with maintenance and repair. Best example probably would be railways. You see, it's much easier for Deutsche Bahn having, say, thousands of trains than it is for Hessische Landesbahn to replace an engine which breaks down, because they have many more on inventory, and it's easier for them to maintain them, or to maintain them. Okay, and indivisibilities is also clear, of course. So here, that's why you have the economies of mass reserves. The indivisibilities should also be clear here. If we were to have this talk in Licherstraße, we typically can observe the railways to Grünberg and to the Vogelsberg, and there is one track, a single track. Okay, even though you only have a train mostly at most every half an hour, and these trains are, apart from the morning, not very well occupied. But the point is, even though you wouldn't need only 1/3 of a railway track, given the capacity, you have to build one full railway track. Okay, that's what is called indivisibilities, and of course the costs go down for the trains running there, and in particular for the network, for rail infrastructure, if you have a higher demand. I will get back to that example here on the next slide: economies of scale versus economies of density. This is just from an example from Chris Nash here. So what is economies of density? Actually, it's interesting that by coincidence I had Wuhan here, and previously when I explained this, I always said if you have one connection from Peking to Shanghai and you extend the line to Hong Kong, because I thought no one knows Wuhan. Now everyone will know Wuhan. That's why I take this example now. Okay, standard kinds of economies of scale would mean that you look into the connection between Peking and Wuhan. Okay, and extending and looking into what happens if you double this route. That is, you extend the length from Wuhan to Hong Kong. There is no much of economies of scale here because it more or less doubles capacity. Okay, the important point is what Chris Nash calls economics of density, and he defines that in the notes where you see that here. Economies of density arise when output rises and all inputs increase proportionately except route length. Okay, we keep this length between Wuhan and Peking constant and add another track. That's actually what is done between Frankfurt and feedback right now because there are serious capacity bottlenecks and constraints. So, and if we add to the 2 tracks we have currently a 3rd track, this almost doubles the capacity. And if we add 4 tracks, that's what certain studies show you, it quadruples capacity. Okay, you add another 2 tracks, but you don't get just a doubling of the capacity, you get a quadrupling of that. Okay, and what Chris Nash is well-known researcher in railway economics, he said this, the existence of economies of density is probably the strongest theoretical argument for rail subsidies. But the point here is just to make clear that you have these economies of scale. Running out of time right now, as you see. So the last point I want to do before I move on to multi-product firms and discuss that, I will leave that for the lecture in the next week. I want to tell you something about this term I have here, namely the sub-additivity. And because this is our definition of a natural monopoly, we actually use a technical monopoly. Sub-additivity is nothing else actually like we have economies of scale over the whole range. And sub-additivity of the cost function just means that it's cheaper to produce total industry output Q in a single company, so total industry output Q in a single company or a single plant, rather than we do it in several plants. Okay, so if we produce the same total Q in several, it will be more expensive. And it's obvious if we go back to our example here. I have to jump here. If we go back to our example, so of course, if you produce this output Q in a single firm, you will have this average cost curve, but this average cost per unit. But if you have Q over 2 produced in 2 different companies, you have to pay twice the fixed cost, and that's why your average costs is higher. Okay, and that's what's actually here in sub-additivity. A cost function is sub-additive, and therefore actually a natural monopoly. If the industry output can be supplied cheaper, that is at lower cost by one firm than by 2 or more firms. That's what we call a natural monopoly, because costs are minimized if a single firm produces the total industry outputs. This is a purely technological definition, and we cannot conclude anything about that, where in the market we really have only a single firm being active. Think of all the weather apps you have potentially on your smartphone. These weather apps have marginal costs of 0, but some product development costs. So each one would be a natural monopoly. Nevertheless, you have several of them. Okay, so we need to get further on, and that's what we do next week. Discuss what kind of market behavior and market performance leads to actually a situation where we actually have a monopoly in the market. But here, natural monopoly is just defined technically. And one short aside, of course, falling average cost imply sub-additivity, but it's not really required, because here you see they can move up again here, and still it's cheaper to produce a total industry output in one firm rather than in, say, 2. Okay, but that's just a small aside. Okay, I will end here. I thank you for participating. I will be available in Webex for another 13 minutes, or at least 15 minutes. And thank you for being with me, for looking into this. Oops. For looking into this, and I say goodbye here. Thanks. Yeah, thank you. It's done. Unfortunately, we didn't have any subtitles today. I would be really curious how Google managed my pronunciation of weather apps, but we'll see. So I'm available in Webex right now for some further questions, and I have questions to you as well. So see you next week, and thank you.